Sure. I grew up on a farm in the Texas Panhandle, west Lubbock Van Hour, so we understand water issues out there, or lack of water issues anyway. And I've been in DC for the last 6 years, the Department of Ag, and then also working for the Montana State delegation. And happy to be out here right now. And I brought our real expert, Chris Kelly, our hydrologist. So
Great.
any hard questions, go to him.
That's how I feel. Any hard question I get goes out. So that's all good. It's all good. And then, did we get the phone working, do you know? Okay, well, we're hoping to have the phone up and going. It may perhaps cause us some issues with some of our presentations. And if anybody from the public is on trying to contact us, we may not be able to do that. But we have made arrangements for them to engage in other ways, and we will respond. Would you like to explain all that, Otto?
Sure. If folks are tuning in to the live stream of this, you can make comment on that live stream, and any questions that you post there, we will get back to you on those, just not in this meeting, but we will follow up with a posting addressing all questions that get posted.
So we'll continue to try to work on that issue as we go.
I just received some updated information
Yes.
on the teleconference line. If you are tuning in and would like to call in, the number to call in is 1-857-288, excuse me, I'm sorry. The number to call is 1-866-906-98888, and the passcode for participants is 5969240. And I apologize for this technical glitch.
Would you read those numbers one more time and just, yeah.
Sorry,
No,
so
that's okay.
the number to call, 1-866-906-98888, and the passcode is 5969240.
All righty. Thank you. And I do want to thank DEQ for hosting us. We normally meet over in the Capitol, but there are other people filling up all the rooms over there. And we're looking forward to those rooms becoming vacant here soon. So we're going to start off. Where did Ada go? Well, there she is. Ada, you're up. We're going to have Ada give us a rundown on the Montana Drought Management Plan update process.
Thanks very much, Lieutenant Governor. And thanks everyone for your patience today. This is a new room and new technology for us, so there's going to be a couple of hiccups here and there, I suppose. So once Cheryl has there we go, presentation ready, we can move forward. I just wanted to give you guys a little update on our update process. So the last year's efforts, our meetings led to the conclusion that we needed to update the state drought plan, and we conducted 4 drought forums around the state, collected some information. We put together a draft outline that then went around for public comment in November. And from that draft outline, we then moved forward into the next steps, so the actual drafting, or not drafting, but the actual planning part of it. So the next slide, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the timeline for this process, our stakeholder working group, and then our activities of defining drought, creating a response strategy, and creating long-term mitigation strategies. Those are sort of the overarching pieces of our drought plan update. The timeline is a 2-year process. We originally thought we'd be able to get it done in 1 year. That ended up, from our public comment, we realized it probably wasn't feasible, so we're hoping to get this all done by the end of 2018. So year 1, we're going to be doing a statewide vulnerability assessment in cooperation with the Department of Emergency Services. So we're working through that process right now. We are also going to come up with some kind of drought definition for the whole state that hopefully is both locally relevant and also generally enough applicable that we can assess conditions at the state level in a timely manner. Then we'll come up with some form of an emergency response framework, again in partnership with DES, and we'll continue to report to our stakeholder working group. In year 2, we are going to delve into mitigation strategy case studies and looking at what is working around the state and creating some background information there for people to be able to use. And we'll continue working with the stakeholder working group, draft the final plan, and then make that final plan available for public comment. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so the stakeholder working group consists of these members. When we went through the draft outline process, we determined that there were 5 water use sectors: fish and wildlife, agriculture and livestock, municipal and industrial and commercial water users.
Following participants have entered the conference. No names are available.
Can we mute that, please? Thank you. And as well as domestic and municipal water users. So these very generous folks have agreed to volunteer their time. They call in once a month and visit with me over teleconference. I let them know what's going on, and they give me tips and folks that I should contact, reach out to, things that we should look into. Right now, they're really focused on mitigation strategies from each of those different water use sectors, as well as looking at different kinds of funding strategies that might be available. And we do have one of the members of our working group here in the audience, Christy Klein from the Rural Water Systems. If you have questions, Stephen Begley is also on the working group. So they're both here if you want to get their take on things. Next slide. So defining drought, you might think this is an easy question, but as the Lieutenant Governor and I discovered when we toured the state, it seems like everybody has a different definition of drought. So when we sat down to try to create a definition for the whole state, I invited all of the experts that work with us on the monitoring subcommittee, as well as a few others, and we spent an entire day discussing all the different parameters that one can use to define drought. And we decided that because our task is to define drought for the entire state and for all water users, we were going to look at 4 different criteria and then all the different point and gridded data that's available. And you can see on this slide the 4 different areas: precipitation, temperature, water supply, and then drought products that are derived. And then the actual sources of information that we are gathering that data from. So each month when we get together, we make sure we go through every single one of these different ways of looking at our current water supply conditions. And that goes into our reporting to the U.S. Drought Monitor as well as out to the state. And we're trying to refine this so that it can be more and more locally relevant. And stay tuned for that. Next slide, please. The next step, and this map is what comes out of that assessment process each month. This is the February map. We look at conditions as they were the month prior so that we have the best information available to look at those conditions. So this map actually comes out on around the 9th of the following month. So this map came out in March, even though it's describing conditions that were in February. In any case, this map will also be used once our plan is updated to communicate our response strategy. So when you get this map in the future, it won't just tell you whether conditions are dry or wet. You will also be able to say, oh, I'm yellow, I should be talking with certain people, or and let me go through that response strategy right now. So if you're white on this map, and I know this slide is a little difficult to tell, but the slightly less white counties are actually yellow on the hard copy, which is available at the front, or at the door when you came in. So in the yellow counties, in the white counties, you're focusing on mitigation. So it's sort of ongoing, no matter what, we're looking to mitigate here in Montana because we know, based on experience, that it's not a question of whether drought will occur, but when it will occur. So that is our modus operandi. Yellow means that the folks who sit on this committee, the Governor's Drought Advisory Committee, will communicate through staff for this committee, so through myself, to their counterparts at the county level. So for FWP, that would be fisheries biologists. For DES, for Department of Emergency Services, it would be their DES coordinators. For the governor's office, it would be the county commissioners. For DNRC, it would be our regional offices. Each of those folks will get a letter indicating who the other people are in their county that are represented on this committee, but then those counterparts at that county level. And it will suggest, look, you guys are pretty dry, you might be really dry in a few months, you might want to consider getting in touch with each other, perhaps creating a local drought advisory committee. If conditions worsen, then and your county becomes the color orange, then it's going to be a matter of collecting impact reports. So those same people who were contacted when things were looking dry will get another letter saying, are you seeing any impacts that need to be reported? And they will send their reports to this committee, again through DNRC staff. So, and then if things get really bad and we're in the red zone, then it's looking for money to try to put a Band-Aid on those impacts that we're feeling from drought. And these are impacts like municipalities can't deliver water. Folks are having 40% crop loss. We're seeing springs dry up, cattle are aborting. So pretty significant effects from drought. And then blue on this map is just an indicator that there might be flooding concern. We aren't gonna have the same response strategy because there is already a floodplain department within DNRC, and they have a whole program where they work on those types of issues. But this map will help just put a bookmark in people's minds about, okay, yeah, it's pretty wet, for example, right now up on the High Line. And that's pretty much it for the response strategy right now. We are working through how this will all look, but this gives you an idea where we are right now. Next slide, please. Long-term mitigation is going to be sort of chapter 2 of this whole effort, and what we would like to do, a lot of people, they want like a laundry list of all the different things one can do to be more resilient in the face of drought. And here are some suggestions on this slide, though they're pretty general. But these long-term mitigation strategies, they really take a community effort. And so what we are going to present in the plan is a series of case studies that show this is how this approach was used in Beaverhead or in Bozeman or in Joliet. And so you have case-specific area stories of what worked for those people and how they got through any challenges in implementing them. Next slide, please. So you can track our progress at drought.mt.gov, or you can contact me. There's the information. That's all I have for an update right now. I do have a couple slides on conditions from last year compared to this year, so we'll move on to that. So our ongoing activities, as I mentioned, are a monthly assessment and report. Those are available at the table when you came in. They're also available at our website. Next slide. So this month, we did our assessment, and over the last year, we've seen the change as you see on the screen before you. This is from the U.S. Drought Monitor, and you can see that we've had a pretty good reduction in drought conditions in the state. Still a little bit of concern in the southeast corner, as well as along the southwest, sort of moving into the central area. The Smith, Muscle Judith Basin is looking pretty slim for right now, and they have consistently through the winter. So that's an area of concern right now. But you can see for the most we've had some marked improvement. Next slide, please. Especially when you look at the last 5 months, you can see that the winter has been very good to us this year. Next slide. This is just our state version of basically the same map, but you can see that this is how we communicate with the U.S. Drought Monitor. And again, the slides colors are not popping up very well for the new version of the map. We refined the map and tried to make it look a little bit more, I don't know, slick. I don't know if that came through or not, but that's what we're done.
It doesn't work.
Yeah, okay, good to know. We'll work on that. And the 5-month change, again, reflected in the next slide, shows that, yes, we've had marked improvement across the state, and we're still continuing to see very wet conditions along the Northeast. With that, I will turn it over to any questions for me or the next presenter.
I just wanted to say, number one, for the benefit of everybody, again, the drought forums were spectacular. I just really enjoyed getting out and hearing from all the people who came, and I was very taken with the number of people who did show up at the forums. So I thought it was a great way to do some outreach and to learn a lot. And so kudos for putting that together, and thanks to everybody who participated. I have one question though. On the slide where we were talking about different approach, the different colors and certain things, like we would communicate if it was this, or and there was the one money.
Yeah.
I know a lot of the money that we've been able to access, a lot of it comes from the feds. Has anybody taken a look at the new budget proposal? And I know it's just a blueprint, but the president's new budget blueprint, and see what of those programs may have been impacted, because it sounds to me like a lot of programs have been suggested for major cuts. And I'm wondering if that's something that we are looking at, or maybe that's way premature.
Actually, we did look at the effects to the Farm Bill, because that is what funds the USDA Drought Response Program. From what I understand, that bill and its effects will not be touched for another 3 years. I can do some further research and confirm that, but that's my understanding.
I mean, the federal budget's got a long way to go. So I don't know that we need to invest a lot of time, effort, and energy, but it's good to kind of have our thumb a little bit on what's happening, what the potentials are. But who knows if we'll even end up with a budget. I mean, we'll see. Great, thank you. Any other questions about it? All right, great, thank you very much, Ara. The next thing we're going to do is a report from the National Weather Service, and Megan Seiner, a meteorologist from the Great Falls National Weather Service, is gonna help us out here. Great, thank you.
So I apologize, Donna was not able to make it today, so I am filling in for him. Hopefully, I can fill his shoes well. I know
We'll do great.
those are tough shoes to fill.
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So we'll begin by looking at precipitation anomalies for the last several months. This is starting on the water year, the 2017 water year from October of 2016. And on all of the next about 5 or 6 slides that I am about to show, the graphics on the left-hand side of the screen are what are showing the monthly precipitation values. And then on the right side are the percent of average for precipitation. For the purpose of this briefing, I will focus more on the percent of average rather than what the precipitation totals were, just to give you an idea of where we fall, how far above or below average we are. So for October 2016, we're looking at the percent of average precipitation being anywhere from about above average, near normal, about 100% to as much as 200% and even 300 to 400% of average. We had a record wet October for much of the state, but the flip side to that is in November, quite a different story. November, we were very dry, abnormally dry, quite the switch. Percent of average precipitation for much of the state of Montana, about 20% of average. So November was very, very dry. So we started off the water year doing very well above average in terms of precipitation. Then we had the opposite effect going into November. Let's take a look at what happened in December. Well, we did have some more snow beginning to fall, and we had more precipitation across the state, especially across southeastern portions as well as central portions, but still a dry pocket there across north central Montana, and where they were below average at 70 to 90% of average in terms of precipitation in December. In January, much of the western half of the state, west of the Continental Divide, and also across southwest Montana, abnormally dry, still anywhere from about 50 to 70% average, in some places across northwest Montana to about 70 to 90% of average across other portions of southwest Montana, but places over north central Montana and going into eastern parts of the state actually had above average precipitation, so doing better in those areas. Let's forward on to February, and we have a lot more precipitation, but what I want to note here is February climatologically is one of our drier months. It's actually, for many places, the driest month of the year. So even though our anomalies are well above average, it does tend to be a drier month. So we did see more precipitation in February, but overall February tends to be drier than much of the other months. And let's go ahead and look at what we actually don't have March so far, but this is kind of looking at March last year through February of this year. And I can speak on March so far in terms of precipitation. Much of the state has been above average in terms of precipitation. So I suspect when we get the final numbers at the end of the month here, we should see much of the state seeing some of those anomalies being above average. Looking over the last 12 months, March of 2016, that's okay, to 2017, precipitation anomalies, for the most part, for much of the state above average in terms of the percent of average of precipitation. Still a pocket across the Continental Divide there over southwest Montana, where precipitation anomalies are below what the average is. Next slide, please. And looking at the water year, which again began on October 1st of last year. So in the last slide, we were looking at the last 12 months. So that was March of last year through February of this year. Now we're looking at the water year, October of 2016 to now. And much better in terms of precipitation. Much of the state, just a couple pockets where we're below average in terms of a percent of average, but much of the state above average in terms of precipitation. Next slide, please. And then if we look at the last year, looking at temperatures and precipitation, average temperatures across the state for the last 12 months, right around 43 degrees. That's about 2 degrees above the average, but of note, over the winter, over the last several months, temperatures have actually been cooler than average. And then of course, precipitation, 11th wettest on record for the state these last 12 months. We've had about 22 inches of precipitation, and that departure is almost 3.5 inches above the 20th century average. Next slide, please. And then this is looking at the temperatures so far for this winter. So looking at October through February, a lot of the lower elevations, a lot of the valleys and the plains have seen temperatures below average. But what I thought was interesting was a lot of the mountain locations have actually had temperatures above average. Next slide, please. Looking at the reservoirs and lakes across the state, west of the Continental Divide, reservoirs are nearly all above normal. This is also true east of the Continental Divide, with the exception of Pitchkin and Nelson reservoirs. And with Pitchkin Reservoir, the water levels are probably lower because of the drought that area was in last year. So going into the winter season, the water in the Pitchkin Reservoir was already lower, so that trend is just continuing. I suspect those conditions should improve with the above normal snowfall that we have seen in that area. And the Nelson Reservoir was actually down for some maintenance last year, and so some of the water had to be drawn down for that reason, so that construction could occur on that reservoir. Next slide, please. And looking at stream gauges, most of the streams across the state, stream flows, are in the percentiles above average for the most part. In fact, some places even across western Montana, west of the Continental Divide, are seeing near record stream flows. Now it's important to note that that's for the date. So that's not overall in terms of season, but for this particular date, March 21st, that those stream flows are abnormally high. Next slide, please. We will return to an El Nino as we go ahead into the late summer and into early fall. This winter we were in a La Nina, and that means that temperatures were cooler than average in the eastern equatorial Pacific. But now we're in what's known as ENSO neutral, which means that temperatures are neither below, or sea surface temperatures are neither below or above average in the eastern equatorial Pacific. That trend looks like we'll shift more towards a weak El Nino as we head more into the late summer and into possibly even into next winter. Next slide, please. And this is looking at temperature and precipitation outlooks for April through June, our springtime season. There are equal chances for above normal, below normal, or near normal temperatures across the state, and there are better chances for above normal precipitation across Montana. Next slide, please. And if we look at July through September, there are better chances for above average temperatures across the state of Montana, particularly across the western and southwestern portions of the state. And in terms of precipitation, most of Montana is anticipating to have better chances for above average precipitation. Next slide, please. And then this is really far out there. So we're looking all the way into October through December. Keep in mind, this is the projection as we shift more towards a weak El Nino. So we do have better chances for temperatures to be above average and equal chances for precipitation to be above, near, or below normal across the state. I'd be happy to take any questions. That's all I have for today. I really appreciate you having us today and having me. Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you so much, appreciate it. Are there any questions? Yes, Anna.
So I was reading about the ENSO, and what I was reading was saying that it's getting less reliable for our area. Do you have any information on that?
Ooh, that's a good question. I haven't read anything specific relating to that. I know that when El Nino or La Nina tends to be stronger, we do see more effects in Montana when it's stronger. But when it's weak, that's where it becomes a lot more difficult to tell what the impacts to Montana will be. There's a lot of other factors going on. We hear a lot about El Nino and La Nina because that's what's most common to people. That's what we hear a lot in the news and in the media overall. But there are lots of other factors that can influence our weather. What's going on in the Arctic can very much influence our weather and sometimes can influence our weather more than what's happening way in the southern Pacific. And also in the northern Pacific Ocean, there are some different oscillations there that can influence our weather as well. But what we've noticed is that combined, the El Nino and La Nina combined with what's happening in the Arctic can give some strong signals of what might happen in Montana. Thanks.
Any further questions? Thank you so very much. Appreciate it again that you took the time to come on down and join us. Make sure we had that report.
I appreciate it. Thank you again for having us.
All righty. Do we have Lucas on the phone?
No names are available.
So it appears.
Ask again, see if you can speak.
Lucas, are you there? Oh, wait a second. We hear a whisper here.
Let me turn it up.
I am here. Can everybody hear me?
Oh, they're very good. We finally got you present. So Lucas is going to give us a report from the NRCS Montana Snow Survey. Lucas, please go ahead before we lose you.
I'll stay on for you guys today.
God love you. Thanks.
All right. Let me know when you have the presentation pulled up, and we will get started.
Looks like it's up and going.
All right. It's a little confusing for me. I'm gonna turn this YouTube off because it's on a delay, so I keep hearing you talk to me again.
Go right ahead if you're ready to go.
All right. Well, sorry I couldn't make it up, everyone. I've got a little bit of an update for you on snowpack and some stream flow forecasts based on what we've seen so far. Megan did a great job kind of walking you through what's led us to where we're at currently in terms of our conditions for mountain snow, and I'll kind of address kind of where we're at. So I think it's important to mention what Megan kind of brought up is that we've kind of seen this vacillation between wet and dry months. And specifically October, in terms of mountain precipitation, was very wet, and that was a lot of rain. And what that effectively did for us this year, as we move through and we look at some of these snowpack trend graphs, if we go to our water year-to-date mountain precipitation there, we have a little bit of a divergence between our snowpack totals and our water year precipitation. And the fact is that October was, as Megan said, record-breaking for a lot of our mountain areas. And then we kind of went through some other dry periods in November. And typically, towards the mid to late part of October, we expect to be receiving snowfall or mountain locations. Temperatures were above average, though, during that period. So we really didn't start our seasonal snowpack until about mid to even late November in some locations. So we were a little behind. But just to explain kind of the difference between water year precipitation and snowpack, which kind of get lumped together sometimes, it's just important to remember that this one starts on October 1st, and October brought a lot of rain, and that kind of put us behind a little bit when it comes to our snowpack. Next slide, we'll get to the month-to-date mountain precipitation slide.
It's up.
So Megan also highlighted this one, and if we look at specifically in the Northwest and there down in the upper Yellowstone as well, we have seen above average precipitation so far this month. We do have some pockets in terms of mountain precipitation down in the Ruby Reservoir area and the upper Beaverhead that have been pretty dry this month, as well as just south of us here in Bozeman. Those are areas that have been kind of persistently behind in terms of snowpack, specifically the Ruby River Basin, and then highlight here just south of town, our snowpack there for one of our sites is the second lowest in 51 years of record. So substantial changes there. So I mean the weather patterns have varied greatly this winter, but so far this month it's really been the Northwest that's been favored with regards of precipitation, and that was actually rain on snow in a lot of areas. But the snowpack was able to soak up a lot of that water without a ton of discharge in terms of melt. Next slide we'll get to is the snowpack percentages for March 22nd. So if we're looking overall at our basins for our snowpack, generally you see a lot of green and blue on here, which is great news for water users in Montana. So right now most of our basins are near or even above average in terms of our snowpack for this date, which is great news. We do see one area, again, Megan highlighted it there, the Smith Judith Muscle Shell River Basin, or maybe it was Ada, that we are seeing below normal snowfall this winter, and we really did see a little bit of a delay there. I have a plot here, but in terms of our accumulation in that basin specifically, our snowpack is below normal. If we think back to our water year-to-date precipitation totals, everything was near or well above average. So this is kind of what I was getting at with that little bit of a dichotomy in these two this year so far. Next slide, we'll take a look at how we did this year in some of these river basins specifically compared to last year. So for all these graphics, the blue line is last year, the dashed line is average, and the solid line is a median. And if we look at it, we can see that generally we didn't start accumulating snow until about mid-November, and in many of these basins it was only the highest elevations that started there in late October. And we really benefited from the February precipitation pretty specifically, and even through March here we can see that for flathead water users, and this is a pretty good trend for the Kootenai as well, so some of our northwest basins there, we have already gotten to about what we expect for our peak for this year, and a lot of it is going to play out with the timing and the weather that we have moving forward as to what we see in terms of the timing of our volumes this year. Next slide, looking at the upper Clark there above Missoula, this goes all the way up to the divide there in Butte. It's a pretty large river basin. But if we look at it, generally above last year, which is great news. And again, the same trend, February and March have been pretty bountiful when it comes to precipitation in this area. And we haven't seen a lot of melt. So some of these graphs that we see, the red line will start dropping as we move east to the divide. Specifically, we saw a little bit more melt there, especially at the lower elevations when we look at those in terms of magnitude, but really right about where we should be in the upper Clark Fork River Basin. Moving to the south there in the Jefferson River Basin, so we can see here that we did see a little bit of a decrease there. I have some more graphs coming up as well, but we did see a little bit of a decrease in our snow water equivalent for this as a basin overall, and that's mostly due to the low elevation melt at our snowtail sites. One thing that's kind of anomalous this year is kind of the transition here early on, but as I'll show you, it's not totally out of character, but it's a little bit early for us. It's been pretty warm and sunny in the mountains. But again, pretty close to normal for snowpack conditions on this date. Looking at the Gallatin River Basin here, south of town, feeding Bozeman area, we can see here not as much snow as we've been getting in the northwest part of the basins and specifically the northern part of the state. And even just to the south of us, we've been kind of left out in terms of our snowfall here, specifically in Bozeman. The Bridger skiers haven't been too happy about that. Big Sky's been doing a little bit better, but in terms of our water, we're maybe slightly below where we should be. But as Megan kind of mentioned, February is not a particularly wet month, so percentages for February can be a little misleading. But March, April, and May are when we're climatologically favored for a lot of precipitation and specifically snowfall in this basin. If we look, we typically don't see a peak until the later part of April or early May. It's a very high elevation basin, so we still have some time, and we expect to see continued precipitation through the next couple weeks. Moving to our south here, the Upper Yellowstone, which this is great news. As we all know, the Upper Yellowstone made national headlines last year for the closures on that river. The snowpack in that area has been really good this year, specifically up in the parks, in Yellowstone National Park. Well above average snowpack for this time. And if we think about it in terms of our normal peak, we've already received the normal amount of snow we expect to see at the peak for this year. Again, it's just going to be a timing of how it comes out this spring. So good news down there. Another area that was a little bit of a concern last year, very dry, and just want to point out that blue line in this graphic for the Sun Teton Marias River Basin, where that blue line is all the way at the bottom. That was the record low for that date. So we've gone from record low conditions on April 1st, pretty much through June for our snowpack, to well above average snowpack for the state. So a great change for them. Megan kind of mentioned the reservoir storage up there. They should be able to make up for some of those losses that they've had over the last couple of years. And looking at our lowest river basin here, the Smith Judith Muscle Shell River Basin, looking at last year was a pretty normal year, which changed this year again, where that red line, which is this year's snowpack, is at the very bottom below the gray line. That is a new record low for those dates. So at the beginning of February and pretty close to the beginning of March, that was record low. But since we've seen some precipitation through the month of March, we have made some recovery, and we'll hope that we see that in the spring. This area really does well with spring precipitation. Our next slide, this is a question I've been getting quite a bit. This is the no-risk data. And so this takes basically the upper left one we have here shows our snow cover. So this is inches of snow depth. So you can see most of the state there covered in snow on March 1st. These really warm and sunny days have melted most of that off in our valley location. So it was pretty much the end of our valley snow cover this month. And it really has been pretty substantial when you look around. But it felt like winter on March 1st. It sure doesn't now. But I guess it's spring, so that makes sense. And moving into the flathead, when we look at some different graphs here, which is another question we've had, is how much melt we've had at these areas. And if we look at these graphics, we can think of this kind of as a test tube. So if that light blue bar is full, that would be the peak for this year for the snow water equivalent. The dark blue there, we can see that we've really only had melt at a number of sites. The highest elevations really haven't moved, and they contain a bulk of the water. It's really been those low elevation sites where we've seen a little bit of melt in these basins here in the flathead. Moving down into a higher elevation, east of the divide here in the Gallatin, you can see really not a lot of movement at all there in the high elevations. It's really been below about 7,000 feet that we've seen most of our melt. And then looking at the Smith-Judith-Muscle Shell River Basin, which is a fairly low elevation basin in general, it's been generally below about 7,500 feet that we've seen that, but it really hasn't been a bunch of movement. We haven't pushed the bulk of our water across yet, so it's not really a cause for concern. Moving into water supply forecasts for this year, we put out our March 1st forecasts a few weeks ago. We'll be putting some out here next week as well. We're going to get out and do all our surveys next week, measure a lot of our snow courses, and get the data from our snowtail sites and update these. But we can see here on March 1st, if we look at the column on the right, that's the average of all the forecasts within the basin, generally indicating near to slightly above average stream flow for the April to July time period. That I highlighted the Sun Teton Marias there. As you can see, about 74% of average was forecasted for the April to July. So we really do need to see some precipitation this spring for conditions to improve there for water users.
Lucas, can we interrupt real quick? Because I think Ada has a question.
Sorry,
Go
Lucas.
for it.
Just to clarify, if you could go back to your test tube slide on the.
Yep.
Yeah, that one, Smith-Judith-Muscle Shell. So those those triangles are the average peaks, or what are the triangles?
That's correct. That's the average peak. So that would be what on a normal year would be the amount of snow water equivalent there. So what this is showing you is that the snowpack is below normal for this date. So in comparison to what we normally expect to see for the peak for that year.
All right, thank you.
And it also shows you where we're at in terms of this year's peak and in terms of drawdown. This is a really nice graph in the spring because you can see what elevations are driving the hydrograph. All right, any more questions on that one?
I think you can go forward.
Okay, we'll go to the map of the stream flow forecast. Again, just kind of showing what we had there. Most of our forecasts are near to slightly above average for the 50th percentile forecast. We do have some areas of concern there in the Central Basin, the Smith-Judith and Muscle Shell River Basin, and that's pretty snow-driven in terms of the forecast. We really hope to see some spring precipitation there to help improve conditions. Looking at the Surface Water Supply Index for March 1st, this uses reservoir storage, the stream flow forecasts, as well as observed. Most of the things are frozen up on March 1st at that point. We can see here the yellow color being near average conditions through most of the state with some wet pockets there in the north and the south. And again, it's really just the lower part of the Muscle Shell there that have the forecasts that are coming out that's slightly dry in terms of our Surface Water Supply Index. So just to kind of summarize where we're at, mountain precipitation for the water year is actually above to well above average in many of our locations across the state. October, December, and February, precipitation was well above average for almost all of our mountain locations. Been one of those weird years where we keep going back and forth. Snowpack is near normal for this date in many of our basins and above normal in a few of the basins in the northern and southern parts of the state. And it happened to be the areas we needed recovery from this last summer. So great news in those basins. Near average conditions in most of the other parts of the state. We do have some areas that we're specifically concerned about, and I can discuss with people if they want to contact me about that. Only one basin is well below normal for the snowpack, and that's the Smith-Judith-Muscle Shell River Basin. The well above average temperatures and really the sun is what drives snowmelt has resulted in the valley snowpacks pretty much disappear through this month, and then the elevations of the mountains are really just now starting to feel it. We did have some small streams rise to above bank level, specifically kind of here in southwest Montana and Virginia City. I don't know if anybody saw some of that last week, but that was pretty much low elevation snowmelt driven. Stream flow forecasts for March 1st indicate near to above average seasonal river volumes for the April to end of July time period. There's really only a few river basins that have below average flows forecasted. And really it's the melt and lack of precipitation in some basins during March is going to likely impact our forecast on April 1st. So we will get out to collect some more numbers next week, and we will have a better idea of where we stand. And with that, I'm welcome to answer any questions.
Lucas, Mike Cooney, just a quick question. You've mentioned that, you know, our valley snow has already pretty well melted off. Is that pretty typical? Is the timing of that typical, or are we experiencing that more, you know, earlier than normal, or is there any concern just looking at that? I know we're more concerned about the snow up in the mountains, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the valley snow melt.
Well, you know, it certainly can be a little bit of a concern. I'm not sure it's that anomalous. I mean, specifically compared to the last 2 years, if we think about the warm springs that we've had, it was certainly later than the last couple of years. So that's the good news. That is generally below the areas where we measure, except when we measure our snow courses. So we're really going to gauge the impact of what the low elevation snowpack looks like when we get out this month and we go do our manual transects of snow measurements. And so I think we'll have a little bit better idea then, and I could probably answer this question a little bit better next month with, you know, like how anomalous it is at those very low elevations.
Well, thank you. Are there any other questions? And believe me, I'm not complaining about the snowpack in the valleys because I was tired of shoveling snow. But something tells me I'll be shoveling again a few more times before the season's over with. So, are there any other questions of Lucas? I don't see any other questions. So thank you very much. It's always informative to hear from you, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So
Okay, well, I will be up there next month in person, and
excellent. Well, thank you again. Appreciate it.
you got it. Take care.
Thanks. Alrighty, now we'll move on to the report on flood conditions, and we have Tracy Sears here, and Tracy's going to go ahead and tell us all about flood conditions.
Great, well, thank you for inviting me to your meeting.
Thank you.
Actually, I think it's the floodplain management Montana slides, please. Before we get into a little bit about the flood conditions, I mean, as Autumn mentioned, we kind of are the opposite side of drought. And this is the time of year that we get a little nervous and anxious, and we're sitting in and watching kind of what's going on around the state. Ironically, in our office, you know, upstairs is where Auda's house. They're worried about lack of water. Downstairs, we're really focused on too much water coming down. But we just kind of wanted to not just talk about the flood conditions, but really kind of give an overview of what the National Flood Insurance Program is and kind of what our role is at the state DNRC floodplain program. Next slide, please. So really, when we talk about the National Flood Insurance Program, the whole basis of the program is trying to reduce risk, looking at reducing flood loss and keep people safe by building smarter. There's a lot of different items that are attached to the National Flood Insurance Programs, but really the whole program, the essence of it is trying to get people to really look at reducing flood losses and keeping people safe by building smarter. So our activities occur year-round. Next slide, please. But the National Flood Insurance Program really is an agreement between the local community and the federal government. So this program was initiated back in the 60s, and what it did at the federal level was say we will make flood insurance available to these local communities who agreed to not only join the program, but also that they have to adopt and enforce a floodplain management ordinance. So this is a year-round commitment that communities have to do. Next slide, please. And the program is made up of 4 items. It's made up of regulations, insurance, mapping, and mitigation. And our program deals with all 4 of these items in the National Flood Insurance Program. Next slide, please. So FEMA actually administers a national flood insurance program. At the state of Montana, we actually help the 136 communities that are participating in the program actually administer their local program, kind of keep up to date with the national trends, what's going on, regulations statewide and nationally as well. We're really fortunate that we can actually provide not only administrative but technical assistance to local communities, and this is extremely important throughout the year. The local communities, again, unfortunately have that burden of enforcing the National Flood Insurance Program requirements, not only with the local floodplain ordinance, but they have designated a local floodplain administrator throughout their community. Most of the local floodplain administrators have probably about 7 or 8 different duties within their local community too, so any support that they can get, they're really appreciative of. Next slide, please. One of the things and some of the biggest questions that we get concerns how to access some of these maps. FEMA actually has an online mapping service center. That's probably most of the questions that come in is my property in or out? And this is not just for regulations, but insurance, also for mitigation projects. So this is just kind of just a quick slide just to show how you can kind of access these maps. Next slide, please. And hopefully you can kind of understand how you can view some of the products that are available on this FEMA website. Next slide, please. Most of our communities actually have what they call flood insurance rate maps. And again, these maps they trigger not only insurance premiums, but they are also looked at for regulatory purposes. They're also looked at if you have a federal loan for federal grants and mitigation projects. During flood events, if there is a recovery phase, these insurance rate maps actually are triggered in during the recovery phase, and it gets turned over to disaster and emergency services as they're working through some of their recovery programs. So most of our communities look at just have this paper map. These can be accessed online, but in the last, since about 2006, we've been working with FEMA at the state and with the local communities to kind of help convert these maps into a digital format. Next slide, please. So this is what a lot of our communities that have gone through this, what they call modernization, or you'll hear it considered risk mapping, has been able to take those old paper maps and actually convert them to this digital format. And this is kind of just a snapshot of what we look at as a detailed study area. And this is an area that shows, if you can see the blue areas that are labeled flood fringe and of course the floodway, that's the high risk areas. These are the areas that you're going to have regulations tied to them. If you have federal loans, doesn't matter if it's for a wastewater treatment plant or if somebody's getting like a VA or a HUD loan for a home, these areas are of high concern. And of course, this is where that mandatory flood insurance requirement is implemented as well. But they have this label, this high-risk areas or the 100-year floodplain. This actually, it's a misnomer, it really should be a 1% chance of flood. So it's really, every time we say 100-year floodplain, everybody thinks, oh, well, we flooded once, we have another 100 years. And then we can see a 100-year flood event occur time and time, and that's what we did in 2011. Roundup got hit with it probably 2 to 3 times, so in a 1-year event. So this is these maps are also, these digital formats, we're actually trying to coordinate with some of the other agencies. I know with USGS, Kathy Chase is here, and also National Weather Service, we're looking at maybe taking some of these products and looking at other means to utilize these products for helping for emergency coordinators in the event of certain events, the inundation maps that National Weather Service has been working with. So we're all trying to take this information that's been developed and really hopefully make products that are really helpful to the local community. Next slide, please. Most of our communities actually do not have detailed studies. This is what their maps look like. These are approximate A's. They do not have what they call base flood elevations attached to them. I won't get in a tremendous amount of detail, but they are harder to regulate, and you see these a lot in more of the rural areas. It does show the risk, but trying to do development in there can put a high burden and cost on the property owner and the applicant. Next slide, please. So we're looking at the high risk areas, kind of what we mentioned previously. These are the areas that are of concern. We know that if a flood event were to occur, there's statistically about 26% chance of flooding during 30-year mortgage. That's what the insurance companies are looking at. That's what lenders are looking at. So that's why these maps are really important to their programs. We kind of went over some of this other information. So if you can go to the next slide, please. But the floodway, that was that area that was kind of the hatch, kind of the area that was in what we call the detailed study area. This is the area that we see kind of the fastest flows, the deepest depths of water. In the state of Montana, we have higher regulatory standards that keep that area clear from development. So there's some existing structures in there, but it's very difficult to have new structures go in here, because if we see a flood event, those are the areas that are identified as going to have the highest risk. So insurance requirements, the same as being outside of that floodway, but as we mentioned, there's more restrictive floodplain regulations. The other thing that triggers in here is that these projects are very sensitive, and that they really do need to have engineers that are on board to make sure that if something goes in, and we see a lot of bridges or bank stabilizations or stream restoration projects, we want to make sure that those projects don't cause an increase on adjacent property owners, because that can have a tremendous effect not only for regulations and flood risk, but also for again, for increasing their flood risk on that particular structure. Next slide, please. So the Montana's floodplain program, what we do at the state, if you go to the next slide, please, is we actually have two sections of our program. We have the mapping unit section, and we also have the community assistance program. Next slide, please. These two programs provide assistance to the 136 communities that we have currently participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. We also provide assistance to those communities that are currently not participating in the program. We're seeing more communities come in. Cut Bank just came in probably about a month ago, and now we have a request for 2 other communities to come in. And mainly what's being triggered is not flood risk, but ties to federal programs. So Cut Bank came in because they were struggling, even though they don't have a high flood risk, but they were struggling on getting certain type of loans for homes. And so we have another community that's coming in because they can't get federal backing for their wastewater treatment plants. So we are seeing more and more at the federal level where the tie-in to this National Flood Insurance Program. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at mapping projects, we're working with local communities, we're working with different agencies, we're identifying those areas of the highest risk. We're trying to provide the best information out there so the communities can not only administer their program, but they can convey the risk for that local community. A tremendous amount of outreach goes into just the mapping projects alone, because we really want to make sure that these maps are reflective of the conditions in that local community. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the current mapping projects that we have ongoing. We're going to have some more that will be probably coming up here in the next few months. We definitely have more of a need than we have funding for. And a lot of communities are asking to get their older maps kind of converted into a digital format. Also, if you have different kind of mitigation projects that are going on, Superfund sites that have been completed, like along the Clark Fork, we want to try to capture all those changes that have occurred. Next slide, please. On the community assistance side, we spend an enormous amount of time working with local communities, property owners, various stakeholders. I think every week we have probably 2 to 3 of our staff actually in local communities working with folks. Last year alone, we had over 6,000 recorded calls and emails that come into our office on a variety of items, whether it be regulations or homeowner dealing with insurance issues, or even during the 2011 flood events when folks were having problems with kind of their insurance after the flood event. There's a huge role of what we're kind of working with communities and trying to assist folks throughout the state with. Next slide, please. So where's our role when it comes to flooding? We have to get information out way before the flood occurs, especially when it deals with insurance. Federal flood insurance, you have to have it in place 30 days before an event. And so what we will typically do is we'll watch, eagerly watch what's going on, not just the SNOTEL sites, but what's going on with National Weather Service and trends. And if we're doing a lot of shoveling in our backyards, and we know that it's probably a good time to get the information out. We start probably about in November, dealing a lot with ice jam information, a lot of ice jams that are occurring. And then we continue to go through the spring. So not only we're dealing with insurance, but also we're trying to correlate how to contact different agencies for information, whether it's a National Weather Service or whether they need to get in touch with their local emergency coordinator. We're trying to get this information out. It just offers a chance for people to realize, yes, there's a concern here. You might want to start taking some action and just understand what the process is to move forward. Next slide, please. We put out a newsletter. If you're not on it, please let us know. I'll be happy to add you to the list. This comes out every quarter. We'll have a new one out here in the next couple of weeks. And again, we work with a lot of our partners to bring up some pertinent information about what's going on around the state. Next slide. So as far as disaster and recovery, we do have a role. We're not first responders, but we are working with local communities, not only to get the outreach out, but also to make sure that our local floodplain administrators, since they do have a role in recovery, are working with their disaster and emergency coordinators, not just during a flood, but hopefully before and after as well. There's also items that they can kind of help them with as far as like the maps and know how to do like the emergency permitting. Currently, we have been seeing a lot of ice jam flooding up on the High Line. So we've been responding and passing on information to our partners at National Weather Service who up in Glasgow. They've been actually providing a ton of information to us, but we're also getting a lot on social media that they're not getting that people are sending to us. Because we have floodplains in our name, a lot of times people will contact us immediately and say, what can you do? We need you guys to respond immediately. Or we get requests for people to ask us to handle their ice jams even here in East Helena. Can you guys put some dynamite in there and explode it? So we get a variety of requests that come in. So we do a lot of coordinating and calling. So right now, like I said, we are watching a lot of the ice jam action that kind of occurred over on the Milk River, Harlem, Fort Belknap. I think we're still getting some information coming in from some of the other rural communities. It seems like it was pretty fast, and it's kind of most of it has subsided. A lot of local flooding that has occurred. So we're just kind of monitoring that situation at this time. Next slide, please. The other thing that we do is we try to keep this up to date. This is our local floodplain administrators list, and it's constantly being updated, probably on a weekly basis. But we have a pretty good communication with all of our folks. And one of the big reasons that, as I mentioned, our role in recovery, the local floodplain administrators, if there was to be a huge event, the local floodplain administrators are actually the ones that have to sign off for homeowners to say that their homes are substantially damaged. So it's really important that this list is kept up. If people need information about, if they need information about the local permit or emergency permits, or God forbid they're in a situation where they're dealing with recovery, that floodplain administrator is going to have a big role in that as well. Next slide, please. So that's kind of where we're at as far as flooding conditions. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact either Michelle or myself.
Are there any questions?
There's Marshall Roth, Disaster Emergency Services. I just want to make a comment to Tracy. We just finished our coordinators workshop. One thing we emphasized again is if those counties are doing emergency work in any waterway or riparian area, to please make sure we got DWSAC and the Corps for appropriate looped in for any permits. It really jeopardizes any FEMA funding after the fact. And I know you folks have been really strong partners in pushing that message, but we're gonna hit repeat on that one.
No, I really appreciate that. Marshall brings up a good issue. In 2011 flood events, we had a lot of calls from local communities that could not, or were struggling with getting reimbursed from some of their federal funding because of some of the actions they took. They didn't have all their emergency permitting. So we try to help, hopefully, work with those local communities so they don't get into that situation.
Thank you. Other questions? Anna?
So something we've been discussing in terms of thinking about drought mitigation is how things that you can do to prevent and mitigate flood can also mitigate drought. Can you speak to that at all?
Absolutely. Our regulations really deal with protecting structures and lives. So it's really from the National Flood Insurance Program, it's pretty stringent on what they're looking at, but we do have information that we have put in our model ordinance that kind of talk about these stream restoration projects. And we also try to educate some of our local floodplain administrators that they can actually provide just general information to the applicants that come in. You know, a lot of times when people come in, especially if they buy property near the water, the first thing they want to do is just kind of get rid of all the vegetation. And we really strongly try to take that opportunity to educate them, get them to the right people, and let them understand that if you do have a healthy riparian or wetland area, then you will probably not see the severe erosion issues that you have during flood events, and that you can see hopefully, slower velocities at the same time too. So it's really coordinated, and we work with a lot of partners to get that information out. And so we do try to incorporate that not only in education, but some of our model ordinance information, and definitely like in our newsletters, anything that goes out, we're trying to really promote that as well.
Any further questions, comments, concerns? Hopes, dreams? All right, thank you, Tracy, appreciate that, it's very helpful, thank you. We're gonna break in, deviate from the schedule just briefly. We have Kathy Chase from USGS, and she's got a couple slides, I think, that she wants to share regarding flooding information as well, so.
Yes, well, thank you for having me here. Yeah,
Thank you so much.
so I have 8 slides, but they're very quick.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, so I just spoke with a few of our hydrotechs that are out in the field. I have a few photographs so you can see what's behind some of those maps that people have been showing about flood conditions across the state. And when you go to USGS site and pull up the hydrograph and see, this is kind of what's behind that. So this particular slide shows our hydrographer. He's he's created a tether across the stream, and that boat is actually $30,000 worth of equipment that's going across to measure velocities and depths across the stream. So that's how we get to the flow conditions that you see. We need these on the ground observations, and if you can show the next slide, they're not always easy. These aren't easy conditions to work in, but it's when you need to really get out there and get the data during these high flows. So next slide. And I'll just show a few gauge hydrographs from the Northeast. And what's interesting about these is they show the effect of ice jams on the river stages. These are some of the sites that were in the news because of all the flooding out there. And what you see on March 20th is you can see the sign that an ice jam occurred because the stage just increased instantaneously almost. And now it broke up and started melting off, and now it's receding. So next slide. Same thing at Big Muddy Creek, you see a few of those ice jam effects there, but you also see that flows were just increasing because of the melt that was occurring out there too. Next slide. And again, here's the Poplar River, another site where we had a lot of flooding due to the ice jams, and you can actually see that it might have happened several times on March 18th. So next slide, we'll go over to the northeastern part of the state where we saw, as was mentioned before, some flows that were some of the highest flows on record for this date. So these graphs, what are being shown in the shading is average conditions over this 48 years of record at this site. So the darkish red at the bottom would be the very lowest average conditions, and then the dark blue at the top is the highest. And we're showing 2 years here. So looking at this year on the right side, we see that the flows that occurred over last week and early this week on the Fisher River were some of the highest ever for this date. And actually they're pretty high even for that site for the year too. So next slide. At the St. Regis, we had some big flooding there too. And again, in this case, the dark blue shading is the highest average for 105 years, and the top of that line is the highest ever. So you can see that early this week, last week, we had some of the highest flows ever for this day for this site. Next slide. And this is Lodge Creek near Chinook. To me, it looks like a lake instead of a creek, but that's what we're seeing in the northeastern part of the state. And that's all I had to show. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Kathy. Are there any questions? Thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All righty, we're actually staying right on schedule here. I'm pretty happy with this. We're going to have a presentation from the Lolo Watershed Group. We have Rick Potts from the Lolo Watershed Coordinator, and he's going to be joined by Cassie Herron, who is the Director of the Lolo Watershed Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Thank you, Audit and committee members. And I am So I've interacted with some of you in my former life when I was the refuge manager of the Charles and Russell National Wildlife Refuge during the time when we negotiated our Federal Reserve water right compact with the state and federal government and the 6 counties surrounding the CMR. In my new life, now I have just been hired by the Lola Watershed Group to coordinate a strategic revisioning effort for that organization here over the next year to help them define the most efficient and effective way of being here for the coming years. So fortunately for you all, I've got my colleague Cassie Herron with me today, who has been working on Little Creek watershed restoration and drought management activities for years. And unlike me, she actually knows what she's talking about. So at this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Cassie.
Well, Rick is exaggerating. But I am happy to be here, thank you so much. And I'm actually a volunteer board member for the Lola Watershed Group. I started my relationship with that group in graduate school, helping them facilitate some public meetings around channel migration and interactions with landowners and voluntary restoration work. So that's how I became introduced to Lola Watershed Group and sort of got involved. And then they asked me to stay on as a board member about 2 years ago. So I'm a little new to kind of the drought management piece. It's definitely something as an organization that is very new to us. And as Rick said, we're actually right now trying to define our role in that conversation and in the community and what place we have and what role we want to play. So I'll give you a brief background on kind of what we've been working on and focusing on as an organization, and then a little bit about some of the groundwater and surface water studies that have been going on, just started last year and will continue this year. So great, thank you. And I don't have any controllers, right? So I'll just
No, I'm sorry.
just kind of, okay.
It was blank and I couldn't figure it out.
Excellent. So this is our mission. We were established in 2003, again, just a group of concerned landowners living right on the creek that were noticing really the impact of their interaction with the creek and wanted to understand more about that interaction and that impact and what the group could do to educate more landowners and stakeholders in the watershed and try to mitigate those impacts. So the mission is to understand and conserve the unique characteristics of the Lola Creek watershed, including its wildlife and fisheries, scenic and rural character, local agriculture, and recreational opportunities, while supporting private property and water rights. So again, we're a very local landowner-based group, and agriculture plays a pretty big part in our watershed. So that's definitely at the core of our watershed group. Next one. Thanks. So we try to achieve this mission through 3 main avenues: monitoring, education, and restoration. And so for the monitoring piece, which I'll get onto, we analyze our watershed through different monitoring efforts and information gathering, which I will explain in more detail. We engage residents and interested stakeholders in joint fact-finding, and we try to raise money to do on-the-ground restoration work that will bring back health and water quality to the creek. And that's based mostly on the recommendations that we've outlined and included in our watershed restoration plan, which was EPA approved. It was 2012 or 13, it was kind of the end there, and it was right before I came on, so I believe it was 2012. So next slide, please, thanks. So the different water quality monitoring efforts we have going on, we contract a lot of our sediment data collection to the Watershed Education Network. We did receive a DEQ grant through the 319 program 2 years ago, and so that really helped support a lot of our sediment monitoring over those last 2 years. And in fact, we were able to cobble together some more funding to continue that into this year. So after this year, we're going to have a really great data set of sediment, both through benthic, macroinvertebrate monitoring, and then also through sediment, pebble count, and those sorts of, that sort of data. And then, oh yes, we also, as a part of that DEQ grant, we were able to hire a contractor to investigate the impacts of riprap and hardening shoreline on basically our sediment health, and then also look into options for how we could restore and plant in those hardened banks. And this was complete with a feasibility analysis, cost, So it was really great to see what our options might be if we're ever able to raise funding to try to restore those areas back to a more natural state. And so this next program, which I think Rick passed around a really nice comprehensive cover sheet about the groundwater investigation program. So this was a really neat opportunity, and again, this was largely spearheaded by our board president, Paz. She just stepped off the board in that capacity, but she nominated the Lolo Creek for the groundwater investigation program to serve as a pilot study to look at basically inputs of groundwater, surface water, the interaction between those two, climate impacts, to really be able to model any changes in the future and how that might change groundwater and surface water. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Lolo Creek, but Lolo Creek has had a really hard time meeting the Bitterroot River. In the last decade alone, it's gone completely dry 5 different times. And so we definitely experience dewatering. That's a major issue and another water quality limitation to our creek. Lolo Creek's a really important creek in terms of bull trout spawning habitat and native fisheries habitat, and is quite an important source of flow to the Bitterroot River. So having that disconnection between the confluence, we think is very significant, and we've made a pretty strong case that this is significant on a larger scale. And so I believe that is why Lolo Creek was chosen to be studied so extensively over both last year and this year, and then next year. So it's a 3-year study, and if you go to the next slide, I think it kind of gives a little bit more detail. You can see the watershed. It flows west to east to its confluence with the Bitterroot, and the lower 2 miles you see there, that's most of our development, and up in the headwaters is mostly Forest Service land and agriculture. So I think the next, if you hit next, it kind of points out sort of where it has trouble reaching the Bitterroot River, and then if you hit the next, I think you can hit about 2 or 3 more. So this just kind of shows you sort of how water is moving and where it might be leaving. So what this study is going to look at, it's going to, well, basically they established several new additional groundwater wells, stream gauge stations, and this is all being done on real time, so 24 hours a day, real-time data collection. So really getting an extensive in-depth look at where water is moving, how it's being used, and how climate is impacting any of that, if at all, too. So if you go to the next, I don't know if you can click on that, if it's gonna bring up a map, but it's just a map of all the monitoring sites. So I don't know if you can click that or not. Is that showing? Oh, yeah, that's pretty good. That's the stream gauges, so that's the surface flow. That map that the link will take you to shows all of the groundwater drilling wells as an additional piece of information. So this is our lowest gauge, and this is in that Lewis and Clark neighborhood there, close to the confluence. So you can see kind of peak flow there in March, and then down to where it's gone dry completely in August. And this graph, I think the purpose of this graph, which I was asking for a little more explanation from those guys on this, because I'm not a hydrogeologist, so I can't give you all of the technical science here, but the point of this was to show that groundwater, from what they've been collecting, certainly has a connection to surface water. So the groundwater level rise that we're seeing almost exactly correlates with the surface water discharge that we're seeing. So by the end of this project, we'll have 3 full years of data. GWIP is going to put together a report that basically describes the system from every interaction we're seeing, surface water, groundwater, and how current management practices might be playing a part in our stream flow. there's going to be computer models that will allow us to basically manipulate certain factors so we can gauge in the future what might happen as a result of either more water being put in the system, more rain in a given year, certain things like that. The GWIP folks are going to also give a public presentation of the results, and in fact, we're planning a field trip this spring, and we're opening that up to local landowners and residents and interested stakeholders to go around and actually visit a few of the monitoring stations, ask questions, and then we'll have the comprehensive data set that will be open to the public to access. And this is just a little bit more about the study. So we also have folks from NBMG that are working in collaboration with GWIP to help supplement some of this data. So this is a little repetitive actually from this cover sheet. They had sent these slides, so I don't need to really go into a lot of detail here. Yeah, you can keep going. And this is the map of those monitoring stations. So they're focusing mostly on the surface water stream flow, whereas the other folks are doing more of the groundwater. And they're working together to kind of show, again, where water's coming in, where it's leaving, and how we can address surface versus groundwater. And then you can go to the next one. So another interesting piece of this is that the Montana Climate Office through the University of Montana is also very excited about this data and has partnered with these groups as well to put in a couple of climate stations too. So we have then those data sets playing a part as well in all of this, which really kind of rounds out the entire system. So those are just a couple of folks, or a couple of photos of the different monitoring sites for that, as well as a lot of the metrics that they're collecting. So not only are they collecting atmospheric data, but they're also collecting a lot of that ground, soil data as well, just seeing what's being absorbed in the soil, what's being released. And you can go to the next one. So that's a lot of the groundwater work that's going on. So there's a lot of it. And it's a little complicated, but it's really exciting and interesting how much attention the watershed and our drought conditions are getting from various groups. And so the last few are really just slides about sort of as an organization, what we focused on. Since we are completely volunteer and a lot of the work we do is outreach, we have also started a field trip program with the local school, Lolo School. So every year for the last two, and this will be our third, we have taken out 60 sixth grade students and have taught them all about water chemistry and benthic health and sort of what that means. And it's a 2-day program. We take them out into the field one day and then we go back into the classroom the next day or a few days later and we explain the data. We show them how to make a basic graph. We put it on our website. So trying to educate the next generation of stewards. And then we also give quarterly public meetings on relevant topics, the studies, what we're finding, or any, issues that might come up or questions people have. We try to really address just any questions that come up. So that's one of our public meetings from the fall. And then some of our restoration efforts, like I mentioned previously, we received a grant from DEQ. Part of that grant went towards purchasing 1,000 saplings and revegetating almost an entire mile of Lolo Creek that was burned really badly during the Lolo Creek fire back in 2013. So that's one of the aerial shots of the section that we tried to revegetate. Some of that was on private land, so we worked with a local landowner who was willing to grant us access, as well as partially Forest Service land. And that's one photo of volunteers, but we worked over 2 days. We had a total of 75 people come out, and it was a really successful project. This year, we're monitoring survival, and we're actually looking for follow-up grant funding to try to replenish any die-off that might have occurred last year. They estimate a quarter to a third typically doesn't survive, so that's sort of a bummer, but we're hoping to go back and try and fill in some of the blanks. But so that's some of the work we're doing. restoration wise. And then we also have our annual reports, the first time we put together an annual report. So we have that here for you as well, just to share. And so that was it came out at the end of the year before our fundraiser holiday event, so I apologize, that is a little outdated. But we'll be having another one this year, you're all cordially invited. And I don't know if there's one more slide. Oh yeah, because the last slide I wanted to just let Rick kind of cap it off to talk about sort of this next year and how we're gonna focus a lot on our organizational capacity building and what that means for us in terms of future planning and a lot of these conversations, like I said, that we're having around drought. So I'll hand it back over to Rick.
Thank you, Cassie. The reason I took this job, for me it's personal. Lolo Creek is just too important from a variety of levels, the agricultural supply, biological supply, ecological supply, and historically, as you all know, I mean, it's the confluence of Lolo Creek and the Bitterroot River, what had been a campsite for the Nez Perce and sailors for hundreds and hundreds of years. And of course, the Lewis and Clark expedition camped there not once but twice. And when you look at it today, at the time they camped there, and it looks like a road, not a creek, it's a little hard to interpret, and it's just, Lolo Creek is too important to be allowed to go dry. And so the Lolo Watershed Group is rededicating itself to developing through their new strategic revisioning process to position themselves to do whatever is within our means and capacity. And to do that, we need well-informed data. And so we are grateful to the state for the support that we have gotten to collect these data and establish the relationship between groundwater and surface water so that we can develop a water budget so that we can, because despite popular trends, facts do matter now. And we really are looking forward to accumulating all this information and evolving it into a new body of knowledge to help us guide the strategic planning process. With that,
Thank you. Are there any questions? Lots going on. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, Cassie, go
I would also
ahead.
just like to add that we also really want to thank Ada very much because she's going to be helping us as well kind of with that drought piece and that component of our strategic plan. So we're really excited to get working with you too.
Great. Well, thank you both, Rick and Cassie. Appreciate your being here. Hearing what's going on around the state with so many groups working with water, it's very exciting to see what you're all doing. And as I said earlier, it's really where the rubber meets the road, and that's so important. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for sharing that with us. So appreciate it. We'll move right on. We have the economic risks and opportunities of increased water volatility. Gary Gannon, founder of Sagaya, thank you. And he will be joined by Sharon Brody of the Four Corners Foundation. So thank you very much for being here.
Oh, he's just getting everything ready for me here. I thought he was So can I operate the slide deck through here?
Just don't show that.
Okay, do you mind if I close this, Gary? Actually, don't
Yeah, I'm gonna use it, so.
I'm sure it'll come back on. Hi, everybody. I'm Sharon Brody, the president of the Four Corners Community Foundation. I feel funny not talking to everybody in the room. Thanks a bunch for inviting us here.
Thank you for being
here. And also thank you to the Drought Committee for all your great work. And really, I get so excited sitting in these meetings. Thank you to all the water people in this room for everything that you do. At the Four Corners Community Foundation, we actually care a lot about the economic risks and opportunities of increased water volatility, which at 3:30, really sounds like a mouthful, but don't worry, we'll move it right along. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry.
I
what
probably
was the
broke
problem
it.
with this? No, it's not bad.
It's all right.
It's always something.
And it's always me. That is me.
Go ahead and visit amongst yourselves.
Don't tell them they have a break, because we'll never get them back.
No, I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
No.
Can
I'll
you
open
click,
this
can you
back
get
up
to
unless
this?
Gary doesn't have to be nervous for my entire introduction.
So, will it come right to this?
Ta-da. Awesome.
Hey, there we go.
There we are, back at the Four Corners Community Foundation, that's us. Like I said, it kind of seems like a mouthful at 3:30, so what I really want to tell you is that we're working on a practical example of that. And Gary asked me to say a few words about that practical example before he gets down to the nitty-gritty. I met Gary and the team at Saigaya a couple of years ago. And I was really impressed with the software models that they were building. And as I started to learn about wealth accounting, I couldn't stop thinking, gosh, it would be really great if we could apply this methodology to water. So that's actually what we're doing. Next slide, please. A year later, by contracting with Saigaya and building on the good work that they've already done in this field, we're well into the process of developing something we're calling H2O Tools. At its foundation, H2O Tools is an integrated software platform, or an interactive software platform is a better way to say it, that allows many stakeholders to integrate and then manipulate information. I find it really exciting, but maybe I'm just a geek that way. Next slide, please. At the Four Corners Community Foundation, we've always had an interest in water in the natural world. We think a lot about where it comes from and where it goes and how much of it there is. In the last decade, we've watched precipitation and runoff patterns change dramatically, and we've wondered what that meant for things like irrigation and in-stream flows. H2O Tools is going to help us answer some of those questions. Next slide. But we've also worked at the intersection where human interaction affects water. We were deeply involved in the conversations, we'll say conversations because that's nice, regarding exempt wells. And we helped to establish the Four Corners Water and Sewer District, so we've done some really practical work. Now we'd like to use H2O Tools to help answer some other practical questions related to mitigation and slowing water down as it passes through our watershed. Next slide. But most importantly, I think, or as important, more and more as we start to see that we might have to make some hard choices concerning water, we want to know what our options are, and we want to know what those options mean for our local economy. H2O Tools can assist in that process by assigning a value to those decisions, be it an economic value, a social value, a human value, an environmental value, or a combination of all those things. This is what makes this tool really unique. At least I think so. At FCCF, we have no interest in reinventing the wheel. Rather, we want to complement the work, all the good work out there that's already being done, and there are so many examples of that in the room today. Our overall hope for the tool is that it can help local groups, governments, and individuals work together and support an informed decision-making process around the economic risks and opportunities related to the increased volatility of water. So that's a little bit about what we're doing at the foundation, and now here's Gary Gannon to tell you more.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sharon. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor and Ada. We're really honored to be here. We have a lot of passion for this work, and it's really great to be able to share it with a larger audience. So next slide. So give you a little bit of background on our team. We have a couple interesting folks, a gentleman from the World Bank And he designed a new system for measuring the wealth of nations. And the idea was that true wealth is measured across social, environmental, economic, and human dimensions, not just economic, which is normally a part of gross domestic product. So it's a way of valuing the intrinsic quality of our life and assigning how the social, environmental, economic, and human variables contribute to our overall well-being. Next slide, please. So when we looked at this project, which is focused on Gallatin, focused on water, we wanted to do an evaluation of what the challenges are. So some of the knowns are, which all of you here know really well, is there's a lot of volatility in water. Natural volatility, there are trend line changes in volatility, snowpack coming in a little bit earlier, melting off earlier, and all kinds of anomalies. We also know, especially in Gallatin, that population growth has an impact. Along with population growth, as you all know, you get conversion of agricultural land into residential land. So there's a change in water use that takes place in that process. And also, there are a lot of things that are affected by changed precipitation patterns. Tourism, especially fishing, agriculture is very dependent upon water. So these things are some of the knowns. Some of the unknowns are how do you connect the information between water and all the beneficial uses of water and how that impacts the economics. So for example, if you get a drought season, as you all well know, you're going to impact farming. The rivers may run dry, so impact tourism and fishing. You may get so low that even residential areas might go below the well level. So every one of these things has an impact, an economic impact, which is felt across the local community and the state. The other unknown is how to take that information and to apply it to options for adapting infrastructure or to making decisions. And I think this committee is really focused on what are we supposed to do? I mean, it's one thing to know that something's changing or something, the train's coming down the track, but then how are you supposed to make decisions? Next slide, please. So this is the agenda. We're going to talk about 4 major topics. Water relevant information, about the tool that's being used to use that information, how we engage with stakeholders, and then enhancing efforts of water groups like yours and many others. Next slide, please. So let's start, next slide, with the water relevant information. So a lot of you here in the room, a lot of my friends produce phenomenal information. Montana is really blessed with a great deal of good information, DNRC, Bureau of Mines and Geology, DEQ, and then you supplement that with all of these other organizations. We need to read them. And as I said in the beginning, when we talk about wealth accounting, we think about things not just in terms of one dimension, but multiple dimensions. So you gotta look at census, Bureau of Labor Statistics, economics, census of agriculture. You need to have more insight into lots of things to be able to really understand the patterns of what's going on. Next slide, please. So we're gonna go through these pretty quickly. We're looking at stream flow. Next slide. We're looking at precipitation, and this is both manifest in numbers, which goes into the database, and in mapping functions and other visualizations. Next slide, please. Snowwater equivalent, which is so nicely covered today. All these things, again, have GIS information and lots of data, or many of them, behind this information. Next slide, please. Evaporation and evapotranspiration, which is has to be taken into consideration. Next slide, please. So in the evapotranspiration, real critical to agricultural, understanding what crop needs are and such. So next slide, please. And then finally, groundwater. Everyone here knows groundwater, surface water are kind of like one thing, not necessarily fully understood. And in this area in groundwater, we found there's a lot of missing information. A lot of great people worked on, but it's hard to know what's the shape of the aquifer, what's the total volume of the aquifer, how is water flowing, and what speed across it. So there are a lot of unknowns there, but we do know a lot thanks in large part to the Bureau of Mines and Geology, GWIC, and their work. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about how we're approaching taking all those data and doing something useful with it. So next slide, please. So basically, what we're building, and I should say now we're well into it, but it's still kind of at a preliminary phase. But it's an online platform. So just like USGS, all these things we've seen today, it's something that's accessible through the web. Behind it is a lot of data that's driving it. And the idea is to be able to present complex information in a simpler manner and to integrate information across data sources, which Sharon and I have heard as we met with a lot of stakeholders. This is a real big problem for a lot of people. They have to go to this database and they go to that database, and they put it in Excel and they go over here and there to try to figure out what the pattern is across those data. So we're really focusing on integrating data. We're doing a representation of hydrological properties, precipitation, stocks and flows, how much comes into the system, how it changes over time. What are the water requirements of all the people that need water? The water rights, the water uses, what's the competing or complementary demands upon water, and then what is the economic activity that is tied to the water? So, as you know, when I look at my computer, it's made of all these parts. Well, how much water went into making this PC? It is actually, and how much water goes into agriculture, how much water goes into a residence, how much water goes into all these different activities, and then what is the economic activity that gets generated from that? How much money is being produced? How much tax revenue? So just, it gives us some idea. So we also are very focused on regions. So we want to look at the economic impacts that are related to changes in water. And this is what this committee is particularly focused in on in an area that has to do with drought or excess of water. Well, how's it impacting everybody? Where are you supposed to do it? And then also analyze the options for improving the resiliency and opportunities. How do you do something now? How do you do something in the future that might slow water down if it's going too fast? And then the HO tool is also focused on engaging stakeholders whenever possible to collaborate to come to some decisions. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting challenges, which many of you water experts know, is that when you look at information, it gets aggregated in different types of shapes. We have hubs like watersheds, sub-watersheds. Information gets collected in political boundaries, states, cities, counties, cadastral areas. Was collected here in Montana in parcel maps, actually right down to the sides of who owns the piece of property. And it also gets into environmental zones where, like a deer or a fish is not thinking about any of or many of these zones. They're living in these zones. So we're focused in on integrating across those boundaries. So if you have data for one, you can understand how it fits into a different dimension. So that's a really big part of our work. Next slide, please. So here's an example. Let's take, and I think that critical to this, and this is where we have underlying data, we have GIS data, and let's say that we're taking a look at a parcel view of some location. So we know some information about what's going on in those different properties. This is just a very small example, but what we're trying to do is to say, how can we integrate data across multiple data sets and put them into a single view that allows you to get a lot of information about groundwater, surface water, water rights, land use, the type of agriculture, the evapotranspiration, the precipitation on that area, so you can make some judgments about what's going on. So next slide, please. So there's a layer of land use by parcel outline. Same cadastral map with another layer. Next slide, please. So now we got land use irrigation by parcel outline view. So now, and each one of those dots that you see there, if you click on it, it opens up a dialog box with a lot of information about what's going on there. Next slide, please. And then you get into water rights. This is a really big deal because you want to understand in a drought period, you're gonna have upstream, downstream rights. How do those rights impact one another? If someone takes their full water right, what does it do to people downstream? And then you have groups like Northwest Energy has this huge right in Great Falls, which kind of trumps them all, you know? So if things get really sketchy, how are you going to use that information and know how to take some action? Next slide, please. So, I mentioned earlier that, one of the real international experts in this type of accounting, John, we're thinking in terms of accounting. So a lot of things go up on spreadsheets. People look at, every city, every state's got a budget. And you look at the budget over the year, and you plan for budgets for the year. So we're using some accounting principles that we're applying into water. Observations versus estimates. Stocks, which is how much you have, versus flows, how those stocks change over time. Actuals versus forecasts. Cash versus accrual. So, cash would be like, what's the worth of a water right? An accrual is the water right. So, watershed versus political region aggregation. I mentioned that before. How do you take, something that is within a watershed, but also rationalize it within a political boundary? Next slide, please. So the other thing that we're doing is we're using some of the great work that's been done over decades by leading experts throughout the world. This happens to be a diagram, which I'm not going to get into, which shows the interdependencies and relationship between the economy and water. And as it works out, we're also working with the world's leading ontologists, which probably not going to mean anything to anybody, but we're really working on the highest levels to try to build a system that is consistent with some of the best expertise in the world. Next slide, please. So one of the really key things that we have to do in order to understand water is to understand a water budget. How much water is there? So for a given year, you've got a certain amount of snowpack. The snowpack runs off. It comes at some time. It gets used. So we have water assets on the left side. We've got surface water, lakes, rivers, and we have groundwater. We have aquifers, and we have urban systems. That's like water that's left in pipes and such. And then we have inflows. It rains. We have the watershed, the water flowing. We have economic discharge. Then we have outflows. Some of the water is evaporating. Some water, it gets evaporated over land that's not irrigated, which is a lot of land here in Montana. And then we have what we call economic abstraction, which is all the beneficial uses of water that consume water. Agriculture, residential, industrial, hydropower, all these things consume water, and this is part of the outflow. And at the end, you have a closing stock. What do we start with and what do we end up with? What flows down the stream? Now you'll notice the boxes down there is just a way that, this is like a placeholder for a data set, but you can see where the blue is, we don't have enough information. So what are you supposed to do about that? I know that a lot of agencies here talk about, well, I wish we had more monitors here, that we would have greater insight. Maybe we have partially available information. Maybe some stuff's likely unavailable, and then the yellow stuff is available. And then down the bottom, that's just a couple formulas for water budget. So we're using standardized methodologies for calculating water budgets. Next slide, please. So extending this, and this is a really interesting thing. Everyone typically thinks about the value of information. Well, what's the value of not having information? So for example, in your committee, you're trying to make some determinations about what am I supposed to do? What information do we have? What information are we missing? Well, as it works out, there is a value to not knowing. And it could be very, very, like, let's say that a tornado is coming in, you don't know, that can be very costly. So basically, one of the things that we're going to be doing in this project is evaluating gaps in our knowledge. We know, for example, that there's a lot of gaps in knowledge about the shape of aquifers, the depth of aquifers, the volume of aquifers. We have a lot of gaps in our information about many things, and we also are working to pinpoint where are the places where we ought to be monitoring things that we aren't right now, based on the expertise of, folks like yourself. Next slide, please. So we can turn those water budgets into things that are useful. Here are some analyses. A conceptual water budget, what's coming in, groundwater, rivers, stream flow. We can look over a month of the year. Again, taking some of the good work you showed today and putting it in a different form. Next slide, please. So in other words, once you've got the data, you can show it in lots of ways. Here's another example. Here are different uses of water, and here are the water rights in terms of millions of gallons. So, we can take a look at that. Next slide, please. How about groundwater rights? Those are surface rights, these are groundwater rights, again, over different dimensions. Who's using the different, who has rights over different types of water? Next slide, please. Now, this, we don't really have any data here, but it gives you an example. We have done some evaluation of certain areas, and we found that in some cases, when you look at the water rights compared to consumption, the water right exceeds the consumption exceeds the water right. We've done analysis of also the relationship between water rights and precipitation. Precipitation is the thing that recharges the amount of water, and so that can get kind of detailed. Next slide, please. So this gets really down to the productive use of water, and this is why we really connect the dots between what we call the economy and the physical reality of water. Everybody needs water, and every consumption of water uses it for a different purpose in order to accomplish that goal. Whether you're watering the plants out backyard, you're fishing, hydroelectric power, you can see some examples here. And each one of these purposes uses different volumes of water. Some use a lot of water, some use very little water, but they all are very dependent on water. So the question is, what happens when there's not enough water? In terms of recreation, in terms of fishing, in terms of boating, in terms of hydroelectric power. What happens to a farmer if they have enough water in spring but they don't in the fall? How does that affect the crop price, which then is going to affect the tax revenue that gets generated in the local economy? What happens if the stream gets closed because there's not enough water, it's too warm, and then all that tourism and all that activity around that comes in. So if you look at it, it goes across these social, environmental, economic, and human variables. And then obviously, there are the plants, there are the ecosystems that are associated. Next slide, please. So here's another type of analysis, just gives you kind of an idea of what we're working on. Where you take a particular parcel, we want to have a lot of knowledge about what's going on, not just in a parcel. And this happens to be agricultural, but it could be residential, it could be commercial, it could be the requirement of the stream in terms of what's required to keep the fish happy and alive and well. So with a real granular data set, we're able to say how many, let's say in this case, what's the size of the parcel, how much is irrigated, what kind of irrigation is being used, what's the efficiency of that irrigation, pivot versus sprinkler versus flood, how much water is actually being used, how much water rights are available in that place, what are the optimal requirements for water to really be able to do the greatest crop. You want to know that because if there's a drought, you may not get that much water and it's going to impact your output. So then we can measure what the ag production efficiency is for any kind of water balance. What's the projected value of the crop? The differences between prior valuation. And then the last part really has to do with some work we're doing on trying to look at the intrinsic value of water. Next slide, please. So one of the things too that I think is probably salient for the work you do, and certainly for Gallatin we want to know this, is how do you do vulnerability and threat assessments in a way that gives you some mnemonics, some color coding, some background about what's going on now, what's projected in the future, when do those projections seem to create vulnerability. So in a way, a lot of what you've been talking about today, integrating all those data and putting it into a common dashboard, that it gives you some insight into what we'll be doing. And bear in mind that associated with this is an economic assessment of what that vulnerability is. It's not to say, well, oh, we're gonna get flooded or it's gonna be too dry. It's like, how much is that gonna impact the state and local communities in a real way? Next slide, please. So, this doesn't really show all this, but in terms of a budget, what we're suggesting is that water ought to be on the budget. The water ought to show up because it has economic consequences. And so this is just an illustrating idea that you have stuff coming in, you stuff going out. Well, that includes water, and water impacts all that stuff. But it typically doesn't show up on the budget. Next slide, please. So next slide. So how about engaging stakeholders? Well, we want to be able to provide for in Gallatin, where we're focused right now, things that are useful for different types of stakeholders. Really critical is, and Sharon calls it a game, a type of game, which I think it is. We're building user runtime what if scenarios. What if let's say the temperature increased by X amount, snowpack is Y, and it runs off in Z, Given all that knowledge that we have for the region, what's it gonna do? How's it gonna impact everybody in a very granular way? So we can have specific knowledge about that. We're also very open to, if we have any information, that information we approve, we say, give it to us. We like to have it, we'll incorporate it into the system. So that's where all the micro information accepted. We want to look at competing water users in a vulnerable environment. Who are the people that are going to be affected by one water right, upstream, downstream, whatever? And we also want to be really focused on multi-stakeholder collaboration. How do you support local groups like the great work that was done in the Big Hole River to try to get farmers working with the fish people and try to get it right. Next slide, please. So again, going back to the illustration we had before, is and if you like, please click on the next 2 slides. Okay, right there. So now let's say we got 2 parcels. Now we just happen to be using agriculture. But let's say it's agriculture and the stream flow. Let's say it's agriculture and the subdivision down in the valley. Or let's say it's hydropower. Well, let's say that this is a community of people and they each have some really detailed information about what kind of water they need, what their water right is, what the economic impact is, and what is the baseline water they need to get by. Now, if a group of people get together and this gives them a basis to say, well, hey, if I take my full water right, you're not getting any water, and your crop's going to die, or the stream's going to dry up. So what are we going to do about it within our own group? What are we going to do about it? Well, this gives us some really good information about, and these what if scenarios. You hit a what if scenario, you say, what if this, or this is what's happening right now? This is how we're all going to be affected. What are we going to do about it? Next slide, please. And one more. So now, enhancing the effort of groups. So we want not to reinvent the wheel, but all this wonderful data that's available, we want to bring it into the system. We want to integrate it, build patterns that are useful to lots of different stakeholder groups. We want to continually value that information. For example, if you have a big pile of data and we track how that data is used, if nobody ever goes and uses the data, why do you have it? So the data is only as useful as people actually put it to work. So the other thing that I mentioned before, we want to value data that's not there. What's the value of what we don't know that should be available? Now, this is interesting because it could be an economic justification for the state spending more money on monitoring water more broadly, because it has a cost if you don't do it. But that cost is never measured, so you never can make a justification except, wouldn't it be cool if we did that? So we wanna give a dollar sign connected with that and show how those gaps in information are, impacted. For policy advocates, the system we're building is transparent. You're gonna see where the data came from, when it was collected, all the metadata. You're gonna be able to see it along with the algorithms. The access to the data is wide open, and the quality is very, very good. And by the way, one of the guys on our team built the sustainability indicator system of the World Bank. He's a world leader in data, which really comes in handy when we're doing this kind of stuff. Next slide, please. So this data can also be used, again, we're on the stakeholder idea of enhancing water projects, to be able to have really good detail on a given location, like the great work that's being done in Lolo or other places, that you can use those data for model control and observation. Next slide, please. Also mitigation planning. And so one of the really big things that we're concerned about and we want to bring attention to is that in a world where snowpack is flowing faster, and I saw the slide that you had earlier, the snow's melting earlier, it goes running down the canals, running down the stream, goes out in the Missouri River, boom, it's gone. We've got to start bringing attention, as you folks are already doing, to slowing water down. How do you do that? I mean, if in fact you're gonna have water running off really fast and then it's not gonna be available to anybody through the year, how do you slow it down? And I think to the extent that we can really make a good story and show the economic impact of not doing anything, again, it's a justification for the state to say, we ought to be spending money slowing water down. However you imagine that to be, whatever that takes to have happen. Next slide, please. So, in summary, there's a lot of data that we can use to do what we think is pretty significant work and to highlight areas of vulnerability. And by combining our water budgets with and water requirements for different users, we think through the tool we're going to be able to provide a nice baseline for stakeholders to be able to resolve water issues. And as you know, at some time, one of those stakeholders might be the state and say, thou shalt do this. But I know everyone here in Montana would like to say, hey, can't we just kind of do this on our own? Can we have some good tools that help us collaborate and come to decisions? And then again, to evaluate the estimate of requiring certain water information. Next slide, please. So that's it. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Are there any questions? It's a lot of good information, and Sharon, appreciate very much your participation as well. Autumn?
So is this a tool that's being developed for the Four Corners Foundation, or is this, Four Corners Community Foundation? Or is this something that will be generally available, or is this something that must be paid for?
Well, right now, this is something that we're commissioned to do for Four Corners Community Foundation. Initially, the idea is to provide this to a limited number of stakeholders because it's really a prototype, try to get some feedback about how it's working. It's really within the realm of next steps for Sharon. Right now, we're just focused on collecting data for Gallatin. So, it has a potential, it's designed to work anywhere, but we're just focusing on Gallatin. And Sharon, if you want to answer that.
Just the necessity of software modeling. A lot of work that we're doing for the Gallatin is kind of foundation work, that would work for other watersheds. Just because it's a pyramid that you build on, you have to have this, and that is transferable to some extent.
And one other component of that is obviously it takes a lot of time and work to collect those data, integrate those data. So, if we didn't work in other areas, if there's going to be a cost associated with it. I mean, it takes some money to be able to do the work. But right now, we're just tightly focused on Gallatin, trying to get this thing done in prototype. And I hope at some point we can come back and show you the tool, because it's going to be pretty soon. It's going to be just.
Can you talk about the timeline for the tool a little bit? Because that always
So we're hoping
personally.
hoping to have this done July, August. Well, unlike government,
Well, and most nonprofits, that's why whenever they say July, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
You know, what does that mean for me?
So anyways, we've got a fantastic team and they're all really bright and we move really fast. So, and we have a scalable development team, so we're not hesitating to get this thing done. So,
Thank you. Gary, do
There's
you,
another-
yeah, another question, sure.
Yeah, Gary, this is Stephen Begley. I was just wondering about, you included a number of the variables that you're looking at in terms of developing these spreadsheets. I was wondering about if you have climate projections as a,
good point. Well, yeah, there were a lot of things, I mean, just because we only had 20-some minutes, I hope I'm not too over, but we're measuring water quality, which includes water temperature, oxygen levels, nutrient loading, turbidity, all that kind of stuff. We're also looking at long historical projections. We're using satellite data from MODIS and Cropscape and other things for doing analysis. And we definitely are looking at both the connectivity between the historical trend of precipitation and temperature and the projected climate models. And these are all part of the weather scenarios that users can use to, to be able to understand. So we're really trying, in fact, if, as we go along, if you folks have anything, wouldn't it be nice if you had this data? Well, we're open to adding those data because we want to have the most comprehensive picture we can. But yes.
Are there any other questions? Gary, did you bring some contact information in case somebody?
Oh, next slide.
Next slide. Look at that, there
Hey,
you
look
are.
at there.
Alrighty,
What a cute.
so there you go.
So
Please take that information down if you'd like to contact Gary or Sharon to have further conversations about this and the tool they're developing.
Or if you wanna play with the tool later, play the water game.
So
Because we'll be looking
we're all
for
about
input.
collaboration. We depend upon all you folks who produce this great data. So we really hope and look forward to collaborating with any of you that are interested.
Thank you so
All right,
much. Thank you so much. Wow. Lots to chew over here. Whew. That's good stuff. Alrighty, we're gonna move right into discussion of meeting time. So if I remember, Ada, the question that we need, and that I think we posed to folks was, we typically now, from about this point on, meet once a month until October. And the question is that still a schedule that we would like to keep as a committee? Or do we want to perhaps spread it out a little bit further? And I just thought it would be a good discussion to have and to get your feedback and see if we can come to some conclusion or at least have the discussion to meet, to finalize at the next meeting or something.
Just to clarify that the option would be to not meet every month, but only meet when there is a threat of drought. And at that time, so if we have yellow on the map, that could be one way of approaching it. We could do it if there's orange on the map or red. You could leave it to the monitoring subcommittee to recommend to you whether or not you should have a full meeting of the committee. Or we can continue meeting monthly as we are right now.
So, members of the panel, what are your thoughts?
I know I'm not officially part of the committee, but it seems like every other month might be able to capture more differences and you might be able to see change a little bit easier. Can be difficult sometimes to really capture that month-to-month variability, but if you meet as a group together every other month, maybe that would help really capture what the threats are.
Okay. And with the understanding, I think that if we found ourselves in a drought situation, we would probably then meet more often. So, what are your thoughts? Yeah,
Marshall Roth, I find, if you still have a regular meeting, if it's every other month, I think that's a good idea, but those updates we get from partners and different stakeholders, so they can plan, I'd like to see those type of presentations as we saw today continue. And then again, I think you just mentioned, if we do need to come together as a group during a heightened drought situation, then we always have that option too.
Thank you. Further comments?
Yeah, I
Yes?
agree, it's Stephen here. I think depending on the need and the year, having the opportunity to explain how various state agencies are responding to drought, I think is one of the reasons why this was put together in the first place. So I think making sure that that information is still getting out there when needed would be appropriate.
Anybody from Audit, do you want to say anything? Or how about our friends from the Department of Agriculture?
Just from my perspective, it's clear this is a very valuable meeting. And my understanding is we're very flexible, and given that, if the need arises for more frequent meetings, you can call that at any time. I think that's an appropriate middle ground there.
Audit?
Discussions at our end of the DNRC have been on both ends of the spectrum, one being that the meeting can get a bit repetitive if it's held every month and there isn't a threat of drought. On the other hand, it is wonderful to have that time to connect and share information, invite groups in, from like the Lula watershed group who came in today, and folks from the Four Corners Community Foundation and SciGIA, and we wouldn't have that opportunity otherwise. So I don't really have a strong recommendation. I can certainly get back to you with one if you would like. I have scheduled a meeting for April, so we can delay a decision until then. We are missing some of our committee members today who may or may not be able to make it at the April meeting, but at least then the legislature will be over. Is that right?
We're hoping.
Yeah, so we might have better attendance, and maybe that would be an appropriate way forward.
Yeah, no, and I think that's fine. And I was just going to say, I think all the conversation we've had around this is very good. When we were out doing our community forums, I mean, one of the things that we did pick up from almost everybody is the sooner information can get out, the better it is for everybody. So, I mean, talking about drought when drought is just upon us is probably a bit too late. So, I mean, I think we need to keep that in mind too. The more we can be, I don't believe in the word proactive, because you're either active or you're not active. There's not degrees of activity in my mind, but the more you can be proactive, in this particular case, perhaps it's a good thing. And so I would just hope that however we decide to proceed, that we keep that in mind so that we're able to respond as quickly as possible. So with that in mind, let me suggest that we go ahead with our April 28th meeting, and at that point we will then decide on a more permanent basis how we'll proceed, and we'll see how things look at that point, if that's okay. All righty, is that okay with everybody? Wonderful. This is the time we will open it up for public comment. And so if there's anybody in the room here from the public who would like to get up and share anything with us, that would be fine. And I would certainly offer anybody on the telephone, if we have any members of the public on the telephone who would maybe like to share information with us, this would be the appropriate time. So if you're in the room, just head up to the podium. Don't be shy. You're all shy. All righty. Excellent. Is there anybody on the telephone from the public who would like to make any comments? Going once, going twice. You have something? You're not the member of the public. I can't know. This is wrong. Yes, Ada, go ahead, please. I think we have no public comment, except whatever you're going to say.
So I received a message from Mike Sweet over at the Montana Climate Office. He said he was going to try to make it, but if he couldn't make it, to read this. On September 6th and 7th, the Montana Climate Office and the National Weather Service offices in Montana will be hosting what they are calling, a climate summit at the University of Montana. They are still in the planning stages and have an upcoming planning meeting, but they hope to make a formal announcement around the first week of April. So consider yourselves the first to know.
How was that, UM?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. All righty, is there anything else for the good of the order? Seeing no other stuff, good for the order, we will adjourn this meeting. Let me just, before I formally do, say thank you to everybody who came and participated. You're welcome back anytime. You did a fabulous job. And so And Devin. Devin, thank you for helping us and putting up with us and getting us on track. Thank you. It was great to have the phone working and have everything working the way it's supposed to. And again, I want to thank DEQ for letting us use this room. And I think, are we back here again? This is where we'll meet on April 28th. Thank you all so very, very much.
Yeah.